A handful of wild grass seeds sits crushed between two stones. Someone left it too long. Water got into it. Days passed. What should have been thrown away instead began to change, bubbling, faintly, souring, swelling on its own. No one intended this. No one understood it. And yet, from that single ignored mistake, an entire species would eventually build cities, currencies, and empires. We assume bread was invented. It wasn't. It was noticed by someone who almost threw it away. Most people picture bread as an invention, a moment of genius, a person deciding one day to bake, a eureka moment, deliberate and clean. That image is wrong. The archaeological record tells a messier story. Charred fragments of flatbread-like food, found at a site in the Jordanian desert, have been dated to roughly 14,000. 400 years ago, thousands of years before humans domesticated wheat, and thousands of years before agriculture existed at all. That detail should stop you. Bread-like food existed before farming, before fields, before anyone had a reason to expect it, which means bread wasn't the reward for inventing agriculture. It may have been the reason agriculture got invented in the first place. Long before farming, small hunter-gatherer groups moving through the grasslands of the Fertile Crescent gathered wild grass seeds, wheat and barley's wild ancestors, the same way they gathered nuts, roots, and berries. Wild, uncultivated, and barely edible on their own. These seeds were hard, bitter, difficult to digest raw. Something had to be done to them before they were worth eating at all. So people ground them. Between two stones, seed became grit. Grit became coarse flour. Mixed with water, that flour became a thick, unremarkable paste. Cook that paste on a hot stone, and you get something close to the earliest bread ever made, dense, flat, and almost accidental in its simplicity. There was no oven, no yeast added on purpose, no recipe. Just seeds, stone, water, and fire. 4 things humans already had, arranged in an order nobody planned, that happened to produce something none of them could have predicted. Picture the scene. A hearth ringed with stones. Someone crouched over a flat rock, grinding seed after seed into a coarse gray-white powder that clings to the fingers. It takes effort, hours of repetitive motion for a handful of flour, barely enough to feed one person for a day. This was not a leisurely craft. It was hard, tedious, unglamorous labor, done because the alternative was chewing raw grain until the jaw ached and the stomach still went unsatisfied. Here is where the story turns strange. Wild yeast lives everywhere in the air, on grain husks, on human hands. It cannot be seen. It cannot be summoned. It simply arrives, uninvited, whenever the right conditions appear. Leave a bowl of ground grain and water sitting too long, in a warm climate, and wild yeast will find it. It will feed on the natural sugars in the flour. It will produce gas. The mixture will begin to bubble, rise, and sour, not because anyone asked it to, but because it was, from a microbial point of view, exactly what wild yeast had been waiting for. To an early human, this would have looked like spoilage, paste that shouldn't be behaving the way it was behaving, something gone wrong. Except when that spoiled paste was cooked anyway, whether from necessity, curiosity, or simple thrift, the result wasn't inedible. It was lighter, softer, different in a way that must have been startling the first time anyone noticed it. Researchers who study the origins of fermentation describe this as one of the earliest known cases of humans domesticating a living organism they couldn't see, couldn't name, and didn't understand years, possibly millennia, before anyone had a word for yeast at all. The first leavened bread in human history may not have been created. It may have simply been the one batch someone didn't throw away. A single accident doesn't become a tradition unless something rewards repeating it. Fermented dough, it turns out, had quiet advantages that had nothing to do with taste. The fermentation process partially breaks down certain difficult compounds in raw grain, making the nutrients inside more accessible to the human body. Cooked, leavened bread was, in measurable ways, easier to digest and more nutritionally useful than the dense, unfermented paste that came before it. None of this would have been understood by the people making it. There was no science, no germ theory, no microscope. There was only a simple, repeatable observation. The batches left a little longer in a warm corner near yesterday's dough, those turned out better, lighter, more filling. So people began, without knowing why, to keep a little of the old dough aside, to mix it into the new, to let it sit before cooking, instead of cooking it immediately. They were, without realizing it, keeping a colony of living organisms alive across generations, feeding it, sheltering it, passing it from one batch to the next. This is one of the oldest continuous relationships between humans and another species that still exists today. A living culture, quite literally, handed down hand to hand, centuries before anyone understood what was living inside it. For thousands of years, humans gathered wild grain the way they gathered everything else opportunistically, seasonally, wherever it happened to grow. Then something shifted. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Fertile Crescent shows a slow, uneven transition. Wild grasses gradually replaced by cultivated ones, deliberately planted, deliberately harvested, deliberately stored. This transition, what we now call the agricultural revolution, has traditionally been explained as humanity's search for a reliable food supply. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Fertile Crescent shows a slow, uneven transition. Wild grasses gradually replaced by cultivated ones, deliberately planted, deliberately harvested, deliberately stored. This transition, what we now call the agricultural revolution, has traditionally been explained as humanity's search for a reliable food supply. But the timeline complicates that explanation. The desire for bread-like food and the fermentation process that made it better appears to predate large-scale farming by thousands of years, which raises an uncomfortable possibility that some archaeologists now take seriously. Humans may not have started farming purely to survive. They may have started farming to keep making something they had already grown to want. Grain does not need to be cultivated to be eaten as porridge or paste, but bread specifically, good bread, risen bread, bread worth the effort, requires a steady, abundant, predictable supply of grain, harvested at scale, season after season. If bread came first as an accidental discovery, and agriculture came later as the system built to keep supplying it, then one of the most significant transformations in human history, the shift from wandering to settling, from foraging to farming, may have been driven, in part, by an appetite for something that began as a mistake nobody meant to make. Once grain became reliable, bread stopped being an occasional accident and became infrastructure. Archaeologists excavating early agricultural settlements have found purpose-built ovens, domed clay structures, some large enough to serve dozens of households appearing at sites thousands of years old. These weren't the work of individuals feeding their own families. They were shared, communal, sometimes centrally managed. That detail matters more than it seems. A communal oven requires organization. Someone managing fuel, someone managing turns, someone deciding whose dough gets baked first. Historians studying early Mesopotamian records have found bread rations listed among the earliest known administrative documents, cuneiform tablets tracking how much grain and how much bread was owed to whom. Bread, in other words, appears at the very origin of written record keeping, not poetry, not prayer, rations. Before humans wrote down their gods, their kings, or their laws in any complete form, they were already writing down their bread. In ancient Egypt, bread was not simply food. It was, in a very literal sense, money. Workers on major construction projects, including, according to some archaeological and textual evidence, the laborers who built the pyramids were paid not in coin, which didn't yet exist in the modern sense, but in rations of bread and beer. Records from workers' villages show meticulous tracking of exactly how many loaves, of what quality, were owed to whom, based on rank and labor. This detail reframes an enormous amount of ancient history. The pyramids, one of humanity's most awe-inspiring architectural achievements, were built, in a very real economic sense, on bread. Entire hierarchies of labor, status, and reward were denominated not in gold, but in loaves. And the type of bread mattered. Coarse, dark bread made from lower quality grain was food for laborers. Finer, whiter bread, harder to produce, requiring more processing and more waste, became a marker of status, reserved for the wealthy and the powerful. The whiteness of a piece of bread, in other words, was one of the earliest visible signals of social class in human history. Long before clothing, jewelry, or architecture fully encoded status, bread already had. This pattern did not end in Egypt. It echoes forward across thousands of years of human history through Roman bread doles handed out to placate a restless urban population, through medieval European bakers whose loaves were legally regulated down to the ounce, through the dark, coarse peasant bread and pale, refined gentleman's bread that divided dinner tables well into the modern era. A food this basic somehow never stopped being a marker of who held power and who didn't. For most of human history, no one knew what was actually happening inside a rising loaf of dough. It wasn't until the 19th century that Louis Pasteur, studying fermentation in the context of unrelated problems, wine spoilage, brewing failures, demonstrated that living microorganisms, not some vague chemical process, were responsible for fermentation. Yeast, it turned out, was not magic, nor mystery, but a living, single-celled organism, quietly converting sugar into carbon dioxide and alcohol. That carbon dioxide is what makes bread rise. Millions of microscopic gas bubbles, trapped in a stretchy web of gluten protein, expanding under heat until the dough sets into the airy structure we recognize as a finished loaf. Consider the strangeness of this. For roughly 14,000 years, humans were unknowingly cultivating and feeding a living organism, invisible to the naked eye, entirely dependent on their handling of dough and warmth and time, and none of them ever saw it, named it, or understood what it was. Bread was, for nearly the entire span of its existence, a working partnership between humans and a life form neither party could see. Only a tiny fraction of that partnership's total history has occurred with humans actually aware of what they were working with. There is something quietly unsettling in tracing bread this far back. We tend to think of civilization's great turning points as the product of intention, someone deciding to invent the wheel, someone choosing to build a city. But bread's origin story suggests something messier and more honest about how humans actually change, not through singular flashes of genius, but through the accumulated weight of small, accidental, half-understood discoveries, repeated because they worked, long before anyone could explain why. Fermentation was not solved. It was stumbled into, again and again, by people who never saw the yeast doing the work, and simply learned through trial, waste, hunger, and the occasional happy accident which mistakes were worth repeating. In this light, one of the most fundamental human inventions wasn't really invented by humans at all. It was co-created, silently, by a microorganism that had been waiting in the air the entire time, for someone to leave the right bowl out a little too long. We think of bread as something ordinary, a loaf on a counter, a slice in a toaster, ubiquitous enough to seem almost inevitable. But it did not have to happen this way. It began as spoiled grain paste someone hesitated to throw away, cooked anyway out of hunger or thrift, and found by pure accident better than what came before. From that single hesitation, an entire chain unfolded. A taste worth chasing, a plant worth cultivating, a field worth settling beside, a surplus worth recording, a status worth signaling in the whiteness of a crust, and a science that would take 14,000 years to finally catch up and explain what people had already been quietly doing all along. Bread did not arrive because humans set out to build it. It arrived because, at some forgotten moment, someone was hungry enough, or careless enough, not to throw away a mistake, and the world has been shaped by that decision ever since. Every loaf on every table today carries that same unspoken inheritance. A species that built cities, currencies, and empires not from a single moment of brilliance, but from the quiet decision, made over and over across 14,000 years, to keep something that should have been discarded and to see, patiently, what it might become.